Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, last week we were hit with the patch 0.1.1, and while we were told ahead of time that there would be no major nerfs until the start of a fresh league, there were a few builds that were hit at least a little bit by some bug fixes, having their actual effectiveness lowered, or in some cases, the builds were not only salvageable, but perfectly fine with a few changes to them. So today, in the aftermath of this patch, and of course as players try and find new ways to play the game in general too, let's talk about the best builds that I've seen in 0.1.1 so far, for each ascendancy, with a note that I'll be showing footage from other creators of people who made each of these builds, and their channel will both be on screen and linked below the video itself if you want to check their build out in more detail and consider actually working towards it yourself long term, maybe. Though through the nature of what we're doing, these builds are all ultra endgame. That said, starting off then, let's talk about Titan and their default attack build. This is more or less the same as when we last talked about it, with the main reason this functions being that there isn't really a mace skill that particularly outshines the base mace attack skill, given that it has no mana cost and therefore can scale extremely high with melee skill levels without actually needing much investment in keeping cost down alongside it. As well, you can use it with a cultist great hammer base, which makes strike attacks deal splash damage around them, which assists with the actual main goals for clearing in this build for mapping, which is adding flat cold damage to your kit, then using the Pole Circle unique ring, which makes chilled enemies shatter as if they were frozen, combined with the Herald of Ice skill as well, and you just walk around triggering explosions as you whack one enemy at a time. After that, we have the Warbringer, and while totem builds still generally do function, they did get sort of collectively hit and collaterally hit within the recent patch too, which has dipped my old favorite Warbringer build out of the top spot, which I think is now currently filled by Warcry, Warbringer once more. Warbringer uniquely synergizes with Warcries by being able to remove their cooldowns entirely, as well as making Warcry explode any corpses for a portion of their health. And then that combined with the ascendancy nodes that help you just absolutely shred armor off of anything you hit, literally removing a portion of the damage dealt per hit. And then basically for general mapping, you just absolutely spam Seismic Cry while running around, and then you carry Ancestral Warrior Totem for bosses with a secondary weapon set that's just two big two-handed meaty weapons that both have multiple bonus levels to melee skill ranks, and one of your Ancestral Warrior Totems has Earth Shatter to let your war cries explode the spikes that they create, and the other with Sunder for any situation that attacks multiple enemies on top of each other, and a higher priority enemy there as well. Next up, the best build that I've seen since the recent patch for the Stormweaver is abusing the hell out of the new Overwhelming Presence interaction. This is a spirit gem that lowers the element ailment threshold and heavy stun threshold of enemies that are nearby you. However, while this skill isn't tagged as being an aura skill, it currently is counting as being an aura skill, which then lets you boost it with things like jewels for your skill tree that increase aura effect. And you can, with high enough rolls and with some corrupted magic jewels specifically with an adorned, you can get it to 99% reduced ailment threshold and 99% reduced heavy stun threshold too, which lets you basically just apply any ailment and apply heavy stun to anything in the game just really easily. Then there's also the Alpha Howl unique helmet, which doubles the radius that this effect counts for up to 12 meters. Then this build is taking that through just a classic Archmage Stormweaver setup with massive mana stacking and using Spark to generate the initial shocks, and then 3 separate cast-on shocks, one loaded up with Lightning Conduit to blast shocked enemies to consume their shocks, which then lets you apply even more shocks, one with Arc for an extra blast of lightning damage and to spread lightning exposure around through support gems attached to this too, and then Ball Lightning in the last one to just apply a load more shocks as well. This has ludicrous boss damage, insane map clearing potential, and it's especially specific to this patch as well because of what has changed. Then we have Chronomancer, and this seems to be pretty much the same as the last time that we talked about it. No nerfs within this patch, but it's still absolutely killing it. This setup focused around Hammer of the Gods, still a super high damage but high cooldown ability, and pairing it with Chronomancer's ascendancy nodes that give it a random chance to ignore cooldowns when using a skill, as well as Time Snap to manually fully reset all cooldowns at will, which just makes single target encounters pretty much a non-factor as a result, especially with the more recent tech using the Trample Toe unique boots, which makes enemies explode for a portion of their overkill damage. Combine that with Shield Wall and the Fortress support to summon a massive ring of walls before you use Hammer of the Gods, and any damage that Hammer of the Gods does to the shield walls will then reflect out their overkill damage to the singular target, increasing your damage by a multiple of itself and making this stack even more ridiculously than before. And you can cast even more shield walls out in between each and every Hammer of the Gods you cast too. As for the map clearing, this is solved similarly to the Titan build that we talked about earlier through a simple combination of working in cold damage to your attacks through gear, and the Pole Circle unique ring that lets you shatter chilled enemies as if they are frozen, and combining that with the Herald of Ice spirit skill, which makes shattered enemies pop and explode, dealing high damage to anything nearby. Next up we have the Witchhunter, and this is just getting obscenely strong at this point. The main synergies at play here are, like the last time we talked about, strong Witchhunter builds, Galvanic Shards as just a godly map clearing skill that chains and forks through enemies that you fire fire at like a hot knife through butter. And then for priority targets or bossing, you've got Shock Burst Round, which does bonus damage to enemies that are affected by lightning ailments, meaning shock or electrocute. You've also got Stormcaller Arrow managed through a bow in your second weapon set to apply a really hefty and consistent shock to enemies, letting you just mass fire Shock Burst rounds afterwards. And the big thing that scales the damage of this setup to the moon is the Fresh Clip support gem in Shock Burst rounds, combined with just incredibly high attack speed and lowered reload time as well, because Fresh Clip gives you multiplicative damage per bolt that you've reloaded over the last few seconds. So the faster you fire, the faster you'll reload, the larger a damage boost that you'll get as a result. Combine that with the Hand of Wisdom and Action Gloves, which give both attack speed scaling with dexterity, and also flat lightning damage per attack scaling with intelligence, which obviously makes it work even better with attack speed because of this, and combo that with the fact that you're already focusing on lightning damage with the skills you're using, and this build doesn't even have Astramentis as an amulet to truly boost the glove, so you could put that in too. It is running Warrior Invictus though for bonus stat stacking from gems that are socketed into that, and this is just taking Witchhunter to a whole new level, really. After that is Gemling Legionnaire. Surprise, surprise, it's the triple stat stacker build, but with a bit of an adjustment from the last time that we talked about it. Fubgun has recently started playing this build archetype, and his version of it achieves a very similar level of incredible damage and pure speed as the original versions, but this one bumps up survivability by a pretty large margin by working in the Atziri's Disdain unique helmet. This effectively gives you up to 36% of your maximum life as extra maximum energy shield if you get a perfectly rolled one and get the ideal corruption onto it. In a stat stacker build where you're already piling on strength for bonus maximum life, which will then translate into more maximum energy shield through this results in an absolutely massive pool of energy shield overall to work with on a build that otherwise has very few flaws to go along with its insane gameplay. Mixing multiple uniques that stack stats to begin with the unique quarterstaff, Pillar of the Gods, that has attack speed scaling with dexterity, weapon damage scaling with strength, and then area of effect scaling with intelligence, and then the unique gloves, Hand of Wisdom and Action, that give attack speed scaling with dexterity, and flat lightning damage scaling with intelligence. And with the right setup around that, you can accomplish some truly just mind-blowingly strong things, functioning especially well with Gemling Legionnaire as an ascendancy due to having the percent all attribute gain ascendancy node, as well as the node for double effect from main stat benefits, which you are stacking loads of anyways, and that makes it work even better with the helmet. After that then, next up is Deadeye, and this is the same as the last time that we talked about it really, with single target still easily being solved by Orb of Storms, combined with Lightning Rod spam, but mapping now being mostly dominated by using basic bowshot skill due to it just not costing any mana, stacking a ridiculous amount of extra levels for the skills to take advantage of no mana cost on it, and then adding on a bunch of flat cold damage to the setup to make it scale extremely well then, with the interaction between Herald of Ice, which you can build to deal loads of lightning damage and shock enemies as it explodes, and Herald of Thunder, which gives you lightning bolts that trigger when you deal damage each time that you kill a shocked enemy. And if you set up Herald of Thunder to do mostly cold damage, then it can freeze enemies when it procs too. This lets Herald of Ice trigger on their death and shock enemies, which will proc lightning bolts, which will kill enemies to proc Herald of Ice again, so on and so forth, just creating an infinite chain as long as there are enemies to proc between. And you basically just abuse the ability of bow shots to enable high damage, starting the chain itself without mana cost within this setup here. Following that, we have Pathfinder, and it's now been a number of weeks, and I still have not seen anything that has really impressed me more than the Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder setup. With proper gear built around it, any weaknesses it had before have been squashed and removed, and now it's just an extremely strong poison-based build, in a way that is very special and unique to Pathfinder, which can apply double the poisons of any other ascendancy, and also just boost their poison in general too, along with Poisonous Concoction itself as a method of applying poison being exclusive to Pathfinder to begin with. I am a firm believer that Pathfinder will always be as strong as poison is within the game, and at the moment, poison is in a pretty solid place, at least if you build around it like this. Then following that, we have the Invoker, and I'm still a massive fan of this Ice Strike Invoker build with the crazy cast on critical setup, and the main focus behind this is using cast on critical to trigger Eye of Winter to mass apply critical weakness to enemies, making it easier to even cast more cast on criticals, and for a single target to mass proc Tempest Bell with a ton of hits per second through these Eye of Winters. The main issue that this build came into previously was essentially just mana management, as even with an absolute buttload of investment into mana, you could still just bottom out in half a second if you got a few crits in a row, especially in boss fights, and so it turns out that the solution to this was actually to put more skills inside of cast on crit, literally increasing the energy it requires to trigger so you cast Eye of Winter less often, in order to sustain mana longer. And so now their cast on crit holds Eye of Winter itself, Sniper's Mark, which helps generate power charges for charged staff even during single target combat, and then Frost Bomb, and you can even have it be a level 1 Frost Bomb, but the idea is that it will apply cold exposure to enemies when it triggers, it will increase the energy cost of triggering cast on critical so it won't happen as frequently, and importantly, Frost Bomb itself has a 3.5 second cooldown, which which means that even if cast on crit itself triggers more than once every 3.5 seconds, it will not activate Frostbomb again, so you hold back even more mana cost as a result. It's just a lovely solution to the problem that I really wanted to shout out here. Next up we have the Acolyte of Chayula, and you're not going to be surprised by this. It is the triple stat stacking build focused around the Pillar of the Cage God unique staff and Hand of Wisdom and Action unique gloves, with the Astromentis unique amulet providing a ton of raw attributes to scale it all off of. I generally don't double up and show the same build for multiple ascendancies, but despite the setup being pretty undeniably the combined strongest and fasting Gemling Legionnaire setup, it's also the same for Acolyte of Chayula, and the second closest thing that I've seen for this ascendancy is just nowhere close. Acolyte of Chayula does also augment this setup a little bit at least, as the ascendancy itself can at its base get a fair amount of mana leech to make up for the obscene mana cost of the setup through the Flames of Chayula, and it can also just get general damage bonuses from the Flames of Chayula as well. Then second to last we have the Infernalist, for which I'm still just fully in love with this barrier invocation comet setup. A lot of people were worried that this got hit and nerfed in 0.1.1, but actually it didn't. They made it so skills within meta skill links cannot generate energy for the meta skill, which people assumed would break this loop that lets you sort of just infinitely create a stream of comets while self-damaging yourself. This actually has not changed this build at all, because technically the energy for barrier invocation comes from damage taken, which you cause through comet combining with the ascendancy nodes for Infernal Flame as an Infernalist, replacing your mana with a gauge that goes up instead of down. But if you hit the top end and overfill the gauge by spending too much mana too quickly, you take damage. So the loop here is the mana cost of comet overfilling your Infernal Flames and doing damage, which then generates energy for barrier invocation to cast comet, and that's the full loop. It is incredibly statistically specific what stats you need to make this build function, but it is undeniably just ridiculously strong once it's actually up and running too, and it avoided being nerfed for now as well. Then our final class for the day is going to be the Blood Mage, and you may be sitting there thinking, finally, it's not Temporalis Inquire the Storms because they nerfed that interaction in the patch, and well, actually it's Temporalis Inquire the Storms. Sorry, not sorry. Patch 0.1.1 made it so that the greater lightning bolts from Choir the Storms can no longer trigger more of themselves when they are critical hits. It also made it so Temporalis cannot lower the cooldown of a skill below 0.1 seconds. Essentially, this was the death of the original version of the auto bomber setup here, as it relied on letting the lightning bolts re-trigger themselves automatically. And now instead you're running high crit chance, you're still running blink with basically no cooldown thanks to the Temporalis unique, combined with cast on dodge to cast spark when you blink, which will cause lightning bolts on crit, which can then also crit themselves, and then cast on crit with frost wall inside. And spark can actually crit on the frost walls themselves, which causes greater lightning bolts from the amulets, which will actually then hit the frost walls, and the creator has even added in the trample toe unique boots that we talked about earlier with the Chronomancer for the frost wall damage, because if you overkill the frost walls through the lightning bolts hitting it from this interaction, you will actually then spread that damage out and explode it around to hit enemies and do a lot more single target damage, especially as that was the main thing that was nerfed by the interaction, so this has been fixed and worked around. But then you've also got Eye of Winter, so you can manually cast it to apply crit weakness to enemies, and for bosses you drop cast on dodge for a second cast on critical, loaded with Eye of Winter itself, so you can basically infinitely loop cast Frost Walls, Eye of Winter, and greater lightning bolts just raining down from the crits that you get with the other skills. Sure, it is less damage than the old Temporalis Inquire the Storms combo, but still absolutely nuts and pretty undeniably top tier for Blood Mage here. That just about does it for today, and everyone. The best builds for each ascendancy, in my opinion, as of this point, post patch 0.1.1 for Path of Exile 2's early access. I hope you've all enjoyed this, and a reminder to just go and check out the original build creators and show them some love if you like what you've seen from them here today. Like if you like the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.